When Marcus Chen reviewed the thermal camera footage from search and rescue, he saw 7 people sitting in a perfect circle in that clearing. But the thermal imaging showed 8 heat signatures. Pisgah National Forest, North Carolina, October 3, 2019, 6:47 a.m. Search and rescue found all 7 hikers alive, conscious, completely unharmed. But when the medics asked their names, not one of them could remember. Not their names, not where they came from, not why they were deep in the Appalachian Mountains, sitting in that clearing. This is what happened in the 72 hours before 7 people forgot who they were. 7 locations across Appalachia. 7 strangers who'd never met. One entity that feeds on something far worse than your life. It feeds on you, on your identity, on everything that makes you, you. And 72 hours earlier, it called them all to the same place. Story 1. The Forgetting Trail. 7 hikers found alive in Pisgah National Forest, October 3, 2019. All conscious, all breathing. None could remember their own names. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. When search and rescue reviewed the thermal imaging, they counted 8 heat signatures in that clearing. 7 bodies visible to the naked eye. 8 showing up on thermal. This is what happened in the 72 hours before they forgot everything. Before something in the Appalachian Mountains took who they were. 7 strangers. 7 locations. One ancient entity that doesn't want your life. It wants you. Dr. Sarah Chen was in her tent in Cherokee National Forest when every electronic device she owned lit up simultaneously at 11:47 p.m. Her phone, her GPS watch, her backup battery, her headlamp, all displayed the same thing, coordinates she'd never seen before, and a single word flashing in red, come. But what happened next changed everything. 600 miles away, at the exact same moment, 6 other people received the identical message. Marcus Delacroix, a wildlife photographer in Great Smoky Mountains. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a geologist on Blue Ridge Parkway. Sienna Oakes, an outdoor blogger in Shenandoah Valley. Reverend Calvin Moss, a historian at Cumberland Gap. Bethany Liu, an emergency dispatcher in Nantahala Forest. Ray Whitlock, a former coal miner in Monongahela Forest. None of them knew each other. None of them had any reason to be connected. What they didn't know was that ignoring that message wasn't an option. Dr. Chen tried to delete the coordinates. They reappeared. She turned off her phone. It turned itself back on, displaying the same message. She removed the battery. The screen still glowed. In West Virginia, Ray Whitlock threw his phone in a river. 20 minutes later, the message appeared on his truck's dashboard display. The coordinates were calling them, and they had no choice but to answer. By dawn on October 1st, all 7 had started walking toward the coordinates, but none of them would make it there the same person they were when they started. Marcus was the first to notice. He'd been photographing a deer trail when he looked at his camera's display and saw something standing behind him in the frame. Something tall, something that shouldn't exist. But when he spun around, nothing was there. He reviewed the image. The figure was gone from the photograph, too. That's when he realized the forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, no wind. Just dead, suffocating silence. His grandfather, who'd grown up in these mountains, had told him, "When the Appalachian forest goes quiet, boy, you've got 30 seconds to find shelter." Marcus looked at his watch. 2:47 p.m., October 1st. He started counting. But what he saw at the 20-second mark would haunt him forever. Every tree within his line of sight bent simultaneously, all leaning away from him, as if something massive was pushing through them toward his location. But there was nothing visible causing it. The trees simply bowed, creating a perfect corridor aimed directly at where he stood. And then, at second 29, the sound returned. Birds. Insects. Wind. as if someone had simply pressed play again. 300 miles north, Dr. Tanaka discovered something that made her blood freeze. She was a geologist, trained to observe rock formations. She'd photographed a specific cliff face at 9 a.m. for her research. Standard erosion patterns, maybe 10,000 years old. She photographed the same cliff at 9:15 a.m. The erosion had advanced by what looked like another 1,000 years. In 15 minutes. She checked her camera's timestamp. Both were correct. She took a third photo at 9:30 a.m., another 1,000 years of weathering. The mountains were aging around her, and she was running out of time. Sienna Oakes was recording a video blog for her followers when she played back the footage and heard it. A voice in the background. Her voice. Saying things she'd never said. Don't go to the coordinates. It takes. It takes. It takes. But she hadn't spoken those words. She was alone on the trail. She rewound the video and listened again. This time the voice said something different. It's already too late for you, Sienna. You're already walking toward it. You've been walking toward it your whole life. She stopped the recording. Her hands were shaking. She looked at her hiking app. She'd walked 14 miles toward the coordinates without realizing it. She didn't remember walking 14 miles. She checked the timestamp. 4 hours had passed. She'd lost 4 hours. That's when she noticed the trees around her were arranged in a perfect circle. Not naturally, deliberately. Someone, or something, had arranged them while she was in that missing 4-hour window. And at the center of the circle, carved into the dirt, was a symbol she didn't recognize. But her phone's camera recognized it. When she pointed the lens at it, her phone's screen displayed text. Cherokee, Forbidden Threshold, where names are taken. In Cumberland Gap, Reverend Moss had found the same symbol in his historical research. He'd been documenting old Cherokee sites when he stumbled across references to 7 locations across Appalachia. 7 thresholds, where, according to legend, an entity older than the mountains themselves waited. The Cherokee had a name for it, but the translation was unclear. The closest English equivalent, the hollowing. Something that empties you out from the inside. The coordinates all 7 had received pointed to the first threshold. Reverend Moss tried to call the others. He didn't know their numbers. He didn't know their names. But somehow, he knew there were 6 others. He could feel them, like a phantom limb. Connected. All being pulled toward the same place. He checked his research notes. According to Cherokee oral tradition, once the entity called you, you had 72 hours before you reached the threshold. After that, you belonged to it. He looked at his watch. October 1st, 8:47 p.m. They had until October 3rd at 11:47 p.m. Bethany Lou was an emergency dispatcher. She'd memorized hundreds of emergency codes, protocols, and phone numbers. It was her job to remember. But when she tried to call 911 from the trail, she couldn't remember the number. Not 911. Not any number. She stared at her phone, fingers hovering over the keypad, mind completely blank. That's when she realized she couldn't remember her own phone number either, or her address, or her mother's name. She tried to picture her mother's face and saw only a blur where the features should be. Panic set in. She grabbed her wallet, pulled out her driver's license to remind herself of her address. As she read it, the ink on the license began to fade. Within 30 seconds, the address field was completely blank. 200 miles south, Dr. Sarah Chen was experiencing the same thing. She was a psychiatrist. She understood how memory worked. This wasn't normal forgetting. This was surgical removal. Specific memories being extracted while others remained intact. She could remember her psychiatric training, her medical knowledge, complex case studies. But she couldn't remember her father's first name, or where she'd grown up, or what her apartment looked like. She tried an experiment that confirmed her worst fear. She wrote her name on a piece of paper, Dr. Sarah Chen. She watched the paper. For 3 minutes, nothing happened. Then, starting with the last letter, the ink began to fade. N, then E, then H. Within 5 minutes, her name had completely vanished from the page. The entity wasn't just in the forest, it was in her mind, actively consuming her identity in real time. By October 2nd at dawn, all 7 hikers had forgotten their middle names. By noon, they'd forgotten their childhood homes. By sunset, they were struggling to remember why they were hiking at all. But their bodies kept moving toward the coordinates. Even as their minds emptied, their legs carried them forward. Something deeper than conscious memory was driving them. Ray Whitlock, the coal miner, understood what was happening. His grandfather had been Cherokee, had told him stories the old-timers wouldn't speak about in daylight. Stories about the entity that lived in the gaps between mountains. It didn't kill you. It hollowed you out, wore your skin, and walked back into the world pretending to be you. But you'd still be conscious inside, screaming, unable to control your own body. All 7 converged on the coordinates at different times on October 2nd. When the last person, Bethany, arrived at noon, they stood in a perfect clearing, 300 yards wide, not a single plant growing in the soil, and at the center, 7 stones arranged in a circle, each stone carved with that same symbol. That's when they realized something had been waiting for them. At first, they thought it was just shadows between the stones. But shadows don't breathe. Shadows don't watch. This thing had presence, mass, intention. It rose from behind the stones, and each person saw something different. Marcus saw his dead father. Sienna saw herself. Dr. Chen saw all her patients screaming in unison. The entity wore their memories like masks. But what happened when it spoke changed everything. It spoke in their voices. All their voices simultaneously. 7 voices layered over each other, saying the same words. You came when I called. You walked when I pulled. Now, you give what I'm owed. Dr. Tanaka, the geologist, was still rational enough to ask, what are you owed? The entity circled them slowly. The answer made them understand why the Cherokee had abandoned these mountains. Names, faces, memories, everything that makes you think you're separate from the mountain. You're not separate. You never were. The Cherokee understood. They paid the debt every 7 years. 7 people. 7 days. 7 names returned to the stone. The entity moved between them, and every time it passed someone, they forgot something else. Reverend Moss remembered his grandfather's teaching and tried something desperate. He stepped toward the entity and said, "Take me. I offer freely. Let the others go." The entity recoiled, actually physically moved backward. For the first time, it seemed uncertain. Dr. Chen understood immediately. It can only take what we fight to keep. If we stop resisting, if we let the memories go willingly, it has no power. But letting go of yourself is harder than dying. The entity attacked differently then. Instead of slowly erasing them, it showed them what they'd lose. Every memory, every relationship, every moment that defined them. Marcus saw his daughter taking her first steps. Bethany saw her mother's face. Dr. Chen saw the moment she'd saved her first patient's life. And the entity offered a choice. The choice no one should ever have to make. Fight to keep your memories, and I take everything. You'll forget, but you'll suffer the forgetting. Or release them willingly, and you'll forget without pain. Either way, you forget. But one way preserves your body. The other way, I keep that too. 7 people stood in that clearing, weighing whether their identity was worth dying for. Sienna was the first to make the choice that would save them all. She closed her eyes and whispered, I release my name. I release my face. I release everything I think I am. Tears streamed down her face, but she kept going. One by one, The others joined her, speaking their identities into the void, offering them freely. The entity screamed, actually screamed, a sound like mountains splitting. And then, silence. Complete silence. And when they opened their eyes, they were sitting in a circle, staring at each other, with no idea who they were or why they were there. Search and rescue found them on October 3rd at 6:47 a.m., all 7 sitting in a perfect circle, eyes open, breathing, but completely unresponsive. When the paramedics asked their names, they couldn't answer, couldn't speak, couldn't remember language. It took 6 weeks of intensive therapy for them to relearn who they were. But they never remembered those 72 hours. And that wasn't the worst part. When they finally met again, 6 months later, arranged by Dr. Chen, who'd recovered enough to practice psychiatry again, they all had the same marking. A small symbol tattooed on their left palms. The Cherokee threshold symbol. None of them had tattoos before. The entity had marked them. Dr. Chen's research revealed something that keeps her awake at night. This happens every 7 years. 7 new people called. The next cycle begins October 2026, and 3 weeks ago, her phone displayed coordinates at 11:47 p.m. New coordinates, different location. Same message. Come. Story 2. The Mimic of Cades Cove. When Emily Patterson found her daughter Lily standing at the edge of their campsite at 3:47 a.m., facing the tree line and humming, she thought the 6-year-old was sleepwalking. But Lily was in her tent. Emily was looking at something else, something that looked exactly like her daughter, down to the pink pajamas and braided hair, standing 15 feet away in the darkness. And when it turned around, it smiled with Lily's smile. That's when Emily heard her real daughter screaming from inside the tent. The Patterson family had driven from Nashville to Cades Cove in the Great Smoky Mountains for a weekend camping trip in late September 2121. David Patterson, Emily's husband, their daughter Lily, and their 10-year-old son Nolan had been looking forward to this trip for months. Cades Cove is one of the most visited areas in the Smokies, an 11-mile loop road through a historic valley surrounded by mountains. During the day, it's peaceful, picturesque, full of wildlife and old homesteads. But what happened next changed everything. They'd set up camp at one of the backcountry sites, about 2 miles from the main loop. David was an experienced camper, had grown up in East Tennessee, knew these mountains. He'd taught his kids all the rules. Stay together. Don't wander off trail. If you see a bear, make yourself big and back away slowly. He'd taught them everything except what to do when something pretends to be you. The first night, Friday, September 24th, passed without incident. They roasted marshmallows, told stories, went to sleep under a clear mountain sky. It was the second night when things went wrong. Nolan woke up first, around 2:30 a.m., needing to use the bathroom. He unzipped the tent as quietly as he could, grabbed his flashlight, and walked to the designated area about 30 yards from camp. That's when he heard it, his own voice calling from the woods. "Dad, I'm lost. Dad, help me." But Nolan wasn't lost. He was standing right there, listening to something that sounded exactly like him, calling for help from somewhere deep in the forest. His blood went cold. He ran back to the tent and shook his father awake. David grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside, listening. At first, nothing. Then, faintly, he heard it too. His son's voice, maybe 100 yards into the tree line, crying. "Dad, please, I can't find the tent." David looked at Nolan, standing right next to him, pale and shaking. "That's not me," Nolan whispered. David called out into the darkness. "Who's there?" The crying stopped immediately. For 30 seconds, silence. Then a new voice, Emily's voice, coming from a completely different direction, near the creek. "David, Something's wrong. Come quick. But Emily was in the tent, asleep. That's when Emily actually woke up, hearing her husband shouting her name. She climbed out of the tent, confused, asking what was wrong. David tried to explain, but before he could finish, they all heard Lily's voice, singing, not from the tent where she was sleeping, but from the edge of camp, near the fire pit. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. Emily's heart stopped. She knew that voice. That was her daughter. She turned toward the sound and saw her. Lily, standing in her pink pajamas, barefoot, facing away from them, singing that nursery rhyme she'd sung every night since she was 2. Emily took a step toward her daughter, calling her name. The figure didn't respond, just kept singing. Emily walked closer. David grabbed her arm. Check the tent first. Emily's hands were shaking as she unzipped Lily's sleeping compartment. Her daughter was there, curled in her sleeping bag, fast asleep. Emily's breath caught in her throat. If Lily was in the tent, what was standing by the fire pit? She turned back around. The figure was still there, still singing, but now it had turned to face them. It looked exactly like Lily. Every detail perfect. The way her hair fell over her shoulder, the small scar on her knee from falling off her bike, even the way she stood with her weight on one foot. But what happened next changed everything. The thing smiled, and it wasn't Lily's smile anymore. It was too wide, too knowing. And then it spoke in Lily's voice. "Mommy, why are you in the tent? I'm right here." David pulled Emily back, putting himself between his family and whatever that thing was. He yelled at it. "Get away from us. You're not our daughter." The figure tilted its head, confused, like a dog hearing a strange sound. "But I am Lily. Don't you recognize me?" Its voice was perfect. Every inflection, every mannerism. It was Lily's voice coming from Lily's face, but Emily knew with absolute certainty that wasn't her child. That's when the real Lily woke up, screaming. Emily rushed back to the tent. Lily was sitting up, pointing toward the tent wall. "There's someone outside saying my name. They sound like me, Mommy." Emily's blood ran cold. The thing outside called again. "Lily, come play with me. I'm you. We can play together." This time, the voice came from behind the tent, a different location. Then another voice, Lily's voice, from the left side of the camp. "Lily, come out. It's fun out here." Then another, from near the creek. 4 different Lilies, all calling from different directions, all sounding exactly the same. David grabbed his hunting knife, the only weapon they had, and stood in the center of camp, turning in circles, trying to track where the voices were coming from. Nolan had started crying. Emily held Lily tight in the tent, covering her ears, but the voices kept coming. "Mommy, let me in. Mommy, why won't you let me in? Mommy, I'm scared out here." The words were right, but the tone was wrong. It was Lily's voice without Lily's fear, without her emotion. It was mimicking the words, but not understanding them. Then the voices changed tactics. David's voice came from the woods. "Emily, I'm hurt. Something attacked me. Please help." But David was standing right there in the camp. Emily could see him. Then Nolan's voice. "Dad, there's something behind you. Run!" David spun around. Nothing was there. The voices were trying to separate them, trying to make them panic, trying to lure them into the darkness where they couldn't see what was calling to them. For 3 hours, from 3 a.m. until dawn, the voices circled their camp. Sometimes they were close, maybe 10 feet beyond the firelight. Sometimes distant, deep in the woods. They cycled through all 4 family members, sometimes calling for help, sometimes singing, sometimes just saying their names over and over. "Emily, Emily. Emily. Hundreds of times. The family huddled together in the center of camp, not moving, barely breathing, waiting for sunrise. When the first light finally broke over the mountains around 6:30 a.m., the voices stopped. Just like that. Mid-sentence, one of the Lily voices was calling, "Mommy, I'm cold." And then silence. Complete silence. No birds. No insects. No wind. The forest was holding its breath. David waited 15 minutes before he moved. He packed up their camp in record time, not speaking, just throwing everything into bags and backpacks. They hiked out at nearly a run, not stopping until they reached their truck on the main loop. They reported what happened to park rangers later that day. The ranger, an older man named Tom Whitfield, who'd worked in the Smokies for 30 years, got very quiet when David described the voices. He asked them which campsite they'd been at. When David told him, Ranger Whitfield nodded slowly, like he'd expected that answer. "That's the fourth report from that site this year," he said. "We're going to close it down for the season." He wouldn't elaborate, wouldn't tell them what the other reports said, but his expression told them everything they needed to know. This had happened before. Emily did her own research when they got home. She found references to something in Cherokee folklore called the Echo People, or Voice Stealers, entities that lived in the oldest parts of the Appalachian Mountains, beings that existed before humans, who survived by stealing voices and faces, using them to lure people away from safety. The Cherokee believed these things couldn't create, only copy. They were mimics, imperfect reflections that studied humans, and tried to replicate them, but never quite got it right. There was always something off, a smile too wide, a voice too perfect, lacking the imperfections that make us human. The thing that haunts Emily most isn't the memory of seeing that copy of her daughter standing at the edge of camp. It's what happened 3 weeks later. Lily came into her bedroom late at night and said, "Mommy, I had a bad dream. Something was pretending to be me." Emily comforted her, put her back to bed, and then sat in her room watching her daughter sleep, watching for any sign, any tell that this was really Lily. Because, in the back of her mind, a terrible thought had taken root. What if the thing in the woods didn't just mimic them? What if it replaced one of them? What if the child sleeping in the tent that night wasn't the same child who woke up? She knows it's paranoia. She knows Lily is Lily. The scar is in the right place, the memories are intact, everything checks out. But sometimes, late at night, when Lily calls for her from her bedroom, Emily hesitates. Just for a second. Just long enough to wonder. And that hesitation, that tiny seed of doubt, is exactly what the thing in the woods wanted to plant. Because now Emily understands that the real horror wasn't what happened during those 3 hours. It was the question mark it left behind, the uncertainty that would follow them forever. The knowledge that in Cades Cove, in those ancient Appalachian Mountains, something is watching. Something is learning. Something is waiting to get better at being human. Story 3. The Lights That Follow. Trevor Hutchins was hiking alone on Brown Mountain in North Carolina when the lights appeared. Not above him, like the famous Brown Mountain lights that tourists came to see. These were behind him, following him, matching his pace exactly. And when he stopped walking, they stopped too. That's when he realized the lights weren't just watching him. They were herding him towards something. It was October 17th, 2020, and Trevor, a 34-year-old software engineer from Charlotte, had taken a solo weekend trip to photograph the Brown Mountain lights. He'd read about them for years, seen the videos, heard the theories. Ball lightning, swamp gas, Cherokee spirits searching for fallen warriors. He didn't believe in any of that. He wanted data. He had 3 cameras, a thermal imaging device, and a drone with night vision capabilities. He was going to solve this mystery with science. But what happened next changed everything. He started his hike at 4:30 p.m., planning to reach a specific overlook by sunset, where the lights were most commonly reported. The trail was moderate, about 3 miles to the summit, well marked and frequently traveled. He'd checked the weather. Clear skies, no storms, perfect conditions. He'd told his roommate exactly where he'd be and when to expect him back. He'd done everything right. But the mountains don't care about preparation. Trevor reached the overlook at 6:15 p.m., just as the sun was setting behind the ridge. He set up his equipment, tripods arranged in a semicircle, cameras pointed at different angles to capture as much of the valley as possible. His thermal camera was particularly sensitive, capable of detecting heat signatures up to a mile away. He turned everything on, set the cameras to time-lapse mode, and waited. The first hour passed without incident. The sky darkened. Stars appeared. The temperature dropped from 62 degrees to 48. He put on his jacket and kept watching. At 7:47 p.m., exactly 3 hours after he'd started hiking, the lights appeared. But they weren't in the valley below like they were supposed to be. They were on the trail behind him. 3 glowing orbs, pale blue-white, about the size of basketballs, hovering 4 feet off the ground. They weren't moving, just floating there, maybe 50 yards back down the trail, pulsing slowly like they were breathing. Trevor's heart rate spiked. This wasn't what he'd expected. He grabbed his handheld camera and pointed it at the lights. Through the viewfinder, they looked even brighter, almost painful to watch. He called out, "Hello, is someone there?" His voice echoed across the empty mountainside. The lights didn't respond, didn't move. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then, very slowly, they started drifting toward him. Not fast, not threatening, just a steady, deliberate approach. Trevor took a step back. The lights stopped. He took another step. They stopped again. He stood still. The lights resumed their advance. That's when he understood. They were reacting to him, responding to his movement. His scientific mind tried to rationalize it. Some kind of plasma phenomenon. Ionized gas affected by his body's electromagnetic field. But plasma didn't behave like this. Plasma didn't track movement. Plasma didn't feel purposeful. These lights had intention. He could feel it. And that feeling made his skin crawl. He decided to test something. He moved left, off the trail, toward a cluster of rocks. The lights adjusted their path, angling to intercept him. He moved right. They corrected again. No matter which direction he went, they repositioned to stay directly between him and the way down the mountain. That's when Trevor noticed something that made his blood freeze. His thermal camera, still running on the tripod, was pointing back toward the trail. He looked at the display. The lights showed up on thermal, but not as heat sources. They registered as cold spots. -40 degrees. Colder than the surrounding air by almost 90 degrees. That was impossible. Light produces heat. That's basic physics. These things were absorbing heat, pulling it out of the environment. And they were getting closer. Trevor made a decision. He grabbed his backpack, left the tripods and equipment where they were, and started moving uphill, away from the trail into the dense forest. If the lights wanted to keep him away from the descent route, he'd find another way down. The mountain had multiple trails. He could loop around, come down from the eastern side. He turned on his headlamp and pushed through the underbrush, moving as quickly as he could without falling. Behind him, the lights followed. And now there were more of them. He counted 6, then 9. Then he stopped counting because they were multiplying too fast. The forest at night in the Appalachian Mountains is disorienting, even in the best circumstances. Without a marked trail, it becomes a maze of identical trees and rocks and shadows. Trevor tried to keep the ridgeline in sight, using it to navigate, but the lights were everywhere now. Not just behind him, but on both sides, weaving between trees, appearing and disappearing, always keeping him moving in one specific direction. Uphill. Always uphill. He realized with growing horror that they weren't trying to hurt him. They were guiding him, herding him like a dog herds sheep. He checked his phone. 8:34 p.m., no signal, which was expected at this elevation. His GPS still worked, though. He pulled up his location. He was half a mile north of where he should be, and he was still climbing. The summit of Brown Mountain was another 600 feet of elevation gain. Why were the lights pushing him toward the summit? What was up there? His hands were shaking as he zoomed in on the map. At the very top of the mountain, his GPS showed a small clearing and a structure. According to the map, it was marked as Old Fire Tower, abandoned 1973. Trevor had read about that tower. It was in the research he'd done before the trip. Built in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps, used for fire spotting until the 1970s, when aerial surveillance made it obsolete. The tower was supposed to be unsafe, structurally compromised, off limits to hikers. The Forest Service had posted warnings about it years ago. People had fallen from it. People had disappeared near it. And the lights were pushing him directly toward it. He tried to change direction, to move laterally across the slope instead of up. The lights contracted around him, forming a tighter circle, closing the gaps. One drifted within 10 feet of him, and he felt the temperature drop. His breath turned to fog. His exposed skin burned with cold. He stumbled backward, tripped over a root, and fell hard on his back. The impact knocked the wind out of him. He lay there gasping, staring up through the canopy at the night sky, and that's when he saw them. Dozens more lights, high in the air, circling above the summit like vultures. Waiting. He forced himself to stand. His ribs hurt. His ankle was twisted, but not broken. He could still walk. But where? Every direction was blocked except one. Up. Toward the tower. Toward whatever those lights wanted him to see. He considered his options. He could fight through the lights, try to break the circle, risk the cold exposure, and whatever else they might do to him. Or he could play along. Go to the tower, see what this was about. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe he'd find other people there, other hikers who'd been herded the same way. Maybe the tower was safe. Maybe this was all some elaborate prank. But what happened next changed everything. His phone buzzed. Impossible. He had no signal. He pulled it out. One bar of service had appeared just for a second, long enough for a text message to download. From his roommate Jake. "Dude, where are you? You were supposed to check in at 9 p.m. It's 11:30. I'm calling search and rescue." Trevor looked at the timestamp. 11:34 p.m. But his watch said 8:41 p.m. He checked again. The phone insisted it was after 11:30. His watch insisted it was before 9. He'd lost 3 hours somehow. 3 hours that his mind couldn't account for. Terror gave him clarity. He wasn't going to the tower. Whatever was up there, whatever wanted him there, he wasn't going. He picked a direction, the tightest gap in the circle of lights, and he ran. He didn't care about the cold, didn't care about the pain in his ankle. He crashed through the underbrush like a wounded animal, branches tearing at his face and arms, thorns ripping his clothes. The lights pursued, but he was faster, fueled by pure adrenaline and fear. He ran for what felt like an hour, but was probably only minutes. And then the ground disappeared beneath his feet. He'd run straight off a drop-off, a small cliff he hadn't seen in the darkness. He fell 10, maybe 12 feet, landing in a creek bed that broke his fall, but knocked him unconscious. When he came to, his headlamp was shattered, his phone was gone, and the lights were hovering above the cliff edge, looking down at him. But they weren't descending. They stayed up there, pulsing, watching. He'd fallen outside their perimeter. Whatever boundary they operated within, he was beyond it now. Trevor crawled out of the creek, soaking wet, shivering violently, and started following the water downstream. In the mountains, creeks always lead down, always lead to civilization eventually. He walked for 3 hours in complete darkness, guided only by the sound of running water and the faint glow of the sky. At 2:15 a.m. by his watch, which still showed the wrong time, he stumbled onto a Forest Service road. At 3 a.m., a search and rescue team found him, hypothermic and delirious, babbling about lights and lost time and a tower. They took him to the hospital in Morganton, treated him for mild hypothermia, cuts and bruises, and a sprained ankle. The doctors asked him what happened. He tried to explain. They nodded politely and wrote, "disorientation due to exposure," in his chart. The search and rescue team went back up the mountain the next day to retrieve his equipment. They found the tripods at the overlook exactly where he'd left them. But the cameras were gone. All 3. The memory cards, the thermal imaging device, everything that might have recorded what happened. Gone. Trevor tried to file a report with the Forest Service. They were sympathetic but unhelpful. Equipment gets stolen on trails sometimes. It's unfortunate, but not uncommon. He asked about the fire tower, about whether other people had reported similar experiences. The ranger got quiet, said the tower was removed in 2008, taken down piece by piece for safety reasons. Trevor pulled up his GPS history on his laptop, showed them the structure marked on his map. The ranger looked at him strangely. "That marker's old data," he said. "Tower hasn't been there in over a decade. Lot of maps haven't updated." But Trevor knows what he saw. He knows what the GPS showed him that night, and he knows that 6 weeks later he received a package with no return address. Inside were his 3 cameras, completely functional. Memory cards intact. He plugged them in, desperate to see what they'd recorded. Hours of footage, all perfectly clear. The overlook, the valley, the darkening sky. But no lights. Nothing unusual. Just hours of empty mountainside, except for one thing. At exactly 7:47 p.m., the moment the lights appeared, all 3 cameras showed the same anomaly. A single frame, a fraction of a second, where the image distorted. And in that distortion, barely visible, was a figure standing behind him. Human-shaped, but wrong somehow. Too tall. Proportions off. And it was reaching toward his shoulder. Trevor hasn't been back to Brown Mountain. He won't. But sometimes, late at night, he sees lights outside his apartment window. Pale blue-white, hovering, watching. And when he checks his phone, the time is always wrong. Story 4. The Stairs in the Woods. Ranger Thomas Kellerman found the stairs on his 3rd week patrolling the Daniel Boone National Forest in Kentucky. Freestanding wooden stairs, 12 steps high, leading to nothing. No building, no foundation, no reason for them to exist. They were just there, in the middle of the forest, perfectly maintained, as if someone had built them yesterday. And when he radioed it into the main station, his supervisor told him to mark it on his map and never go near it again. That's when Thomas knew something was very wrong. Thomas was 26 years old, fresh out of forestry school, excited about his first real ranger position. He'd grown up in Louisville, spent summers camping with his dad, always knew he wanted to work outdoors. The Daniel Boone National Forest covered over 700,000 acres of Kentucky wilderness, and Thomas was assigned to a relatively remote section near the Red River Gorge. Beautiful country, challenging terrain, exactly what he'd hoped for. His supervisor, a grizzled 30-year veteran named Bill Crenshaw, had given him the standard orientation. Wildlife protocols, fire safety, search and rescue procedures. But what happened next changed everything. On Thomas's 3rd day, Bill had pulled him aside after the official briefing and said something that struck him as odd. "You're going to see things out there that don't make sense, things that shouldn't be there, structures, objects. Whatever you do, don't touch them. Don't investigate them. Mark them on your map and keep moving." Thomas had laughed, thinking it was some kind of hazing ritual for new rangers. Bill hadn't laughed back. "I'm serious, son. There are things in these woods that aren't meant to be understood. The Forest Service knows about them. We've learned to leave them alone. You should too." Thomas had nodded, still not quite believing it was a serious conversation. But then he found the stairs. It was October 29th, 2018, a Tuesday morning, and he was doing a routine patrol along a section of trail that hadn't been maintained in over a year. Checking for downed trees, erosion damage, illegal campsites. Standard stuff. He'd walked about 4 miles from the trailhead when he saw them through the trees. At first, he thought they were part of an old structure, maybe a forgotten cabin or fire tower. But as he got closer, he realized they were just stairs. Wooden steps, well constructed, with carved handrails, rising 12 steps and ending in midair. He circled them, studying them from every angle. They weren't attached to anything. The bottom step was about 6 inches off the ground, supported by nothing visible. No posts, no foundation. They just floated there, defying physics. The wood was in perfect condition. No rot, no weather damage, as if they'd been built recently and treated with some kind of preservative. But there were no tool marks nearby, no sawdust, no evidence of construction. They'd simply appeared in the forest. Thomas pulled out his radio. "Base, this is Ranger Kellerman. I found something unusual on the northern section of Trail 47. Can you advise?" Bill's voice crackled back immediately. "What kind of unusual?" Thomas described the stairs. There was a long silence on the other end. Then Bill said, very carefully, "What color is the wood?" Thomas looked closer. "Dark brown, maybe mahogany. Why does that matter?" Another pause. "Are you within 10 feet of them?" Thomas realized he was standing about 7 feet away. "Yes." Bill's voice became urgent. "Step back. Right now. At least 20 feet. Do it now, Thomas." Something in Bill's tone made Thomas obey without question. He backed up quickly, putting distance between himself and the stairs. "Okay, I'm back," he said. "What's going on?" Bill sighed, a heavy sound full of resignation. "Mark those coordinates on your map. Note the description. Mahogany, 12 steps, carved handrails. Then get the hell away from there and don't go back. I'll explain when you return to the station." Thomas wanted to argue, wanted to ask more questions, but the fear in Bill's voice was real. He'd never heard a man that experienced sound scared before. That evening, back at the ranger station, Bill sat Thomas down and told him the truth. The stairs had been appearing in national forests for decades, maybe longer. No one knew who built them or why. The Forest Service had tried to study them in the 1970s, sent teams to document and analyze them. 3 researchers disappeared during those investigations, gone without a trace. Their equipment was found near different sets of stairs, but the people were never seen again. After that, the official policy became, mark them, avoid them, and never speak about them publicly. "How many are there?" Thomas asked. Bill pulled out a map of the Daniel Boone National Forest. It was covered in red dots, dozens of them. "These are just the ones we know about in this forest. Every national forest has them. Some parks have hundreds. They're all over the country." Thomas felt his skin crawl. "What happens if you climb them?" Bill looked at him hard. "We don't know. The people who've climbed them don't come back to tell us." Thomas should have left it alone, should have followed Bill's advice and marked the stairs on his map and forgotten about them. But he couldn't. It gnawed at him, the impossibility of it, the mystery. 2 weeks later, on November 12th, he went back. He told himself he just wanted to photograph them, document them properly. He'd keep his distance. He wouldn't touch them. But he needed to understand. He found the stairs exactly where he'd left them. Nothing had changed. They still defied logic, still stood impossible and perfect in the middle of the forest. He took photos from multiple angles, zoomed in on the craftsmanship. Whoever built these knew what they were doing. The joints were perfect. The wood grain matched. These weren't amateur work. He circled them again, maintaining his 20-foot distance, and that's when he noticed something he'd missed before. There were footprints on the steps, fresh footprints, boot prints, men's size 10 or 11, leading up the stairs. All 12 steps. And then nothing. The prints just ended at the top, as if the person had walked up and vanished into thin air. Thomas felt his heart rate spike. He looked around the clearing. No other footprints. No tracks leading to or from the stairs. Just the prints on the steps themselves. Against every instinct, every warning Bill had given him, Thomas walked closer. Not all the way to the stairs, but close enough to see details. The footprints were recent, hours old at most. The dirt was still damp, hadn't dried yet. Someone had been here today. Someone had climbed these stairs. And where the hell had they gone? Thomas pulled out his radio to call it in, then hesitated. What would he say? That someone had walked up a set of impossible stairs and disappeared? They'd think he was insane. Or worse, they'd send a team to investigate, and Bill had told him what happened the last time they did that. Thomas made a decision he'd regret for the rest of his life. He climbed the first step, just one. He'd stand on it, test it, see if it was solid. The wood held his weight. It felt real. Sturdy. He looked around. Nothing happened. The forest was quiet, normal. He climbed the second step. Still nothing. Third step. Fourth. His scientific mind was racing. This shouldn't be possible. The stairs shouldn't support his weight without a foundation. They should tip, should collapse. But they didn't. They were solid as bedrock. He reached the seventh step and stopped. From this height, he could see deeper into the forest, and what he saw made his blood freeze. About 50 yards away, partially hidden by trees, was another set of stairs. And beyond that, another. And another. At least 6 sets of stairs visible from where he stood, all at different heights, all leading nowhere. He'd only found one because he'd been looking at the ground, but from this elevation, he could see them all. They formed a pattern, a network spreading through the forest like nodes on a circuit board. But what happened next changed everything. Thomas heard footsteps behind him, on the stairs, climbing up toward him. He spun around. There was no one there, but the sound continued. Deliberate, heavy footsteps, starting at the bottom step and descending. Step 1. Step 2. Step 3. Thomas could hear them clearly, could hear the wood creaking under invisible weight. Step 4. Step 5. Coming closer. His mind couldn't process what was happening. He was alone on the stairs, but something was climbing toward him. He panicked, jumped off the stairs from the 7th step, landed hard on the forest floor, rolled, and scrambled backward. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Thomas lay on the ground, breathing hard, staring at the stairs. Nothing visible. No movement. But he knew what. He'd heard. Something had been climbing toward him. Something he couldn't see. He ran. Didn't bother with his equipment. Didn't stop to catch his breath. Just ran full speed back toward the trailhead. He made it 3 miles before he had to stop, lungs burning, legs shaking. That's when he heard it. Behind him. Not close, maybe a quarter mile back, but distinct. Footsteps, walking through the forest, following him. He couldn't see anyone, but he could hear them. Steady, methodical steps, matching his direction exactly. Thomas started running again. Every few minutes he'd stop to listen, and every time he'd hear them. The footsteps. Always the same distance behind. Never closer. Never farther. just following. Keeping pace. He finally reached his truck at the trailhead, jumped in, locked the doors, and drove straight back to the ranger station. It was 3:47 p.m. He'd been in the forest for 6 hours, but it felt like days. Bill took one look at his face and knew. "You climbed them, didn't you?" Thomas nodded, unable to speak. Bill closed his eyes, took a deep breath. "How many steps?" Thomas's voice shook. 7. Bill nodded slowly. "Could be worse. Could be a lot worse. Did you reach the top?" Thomas shook his head. "Okay. That's good. That's very good." Bill walked to a locked filing cabinet, pulled out a thick folder, and dropped it on the desk. "This is every incident report we have related to the stairs. Read them, all of them. You need to understand what you've done." Thomas spent the next 4 hours reading. The reports spanned decades. Different forests, different rangers, different circumstances. But the pattern was consistent. People who climbed the stairs reported being followed, hearing footsteps, seeing shadows that shouldn't exist. Most of them quit within a month. Some transferred to different parks, as far from forests as possible. 3 had gone missing. Their vehicles found at trailheads, their gear found in the woods, but the people themselves never recovered. One report stopped Thomas cold. It was from 1989, written by a ranger named Patricia Donnelly in the Monongahela National Forest. She'd climbed a set of stairs, 14 steps, all the way to the top. She'd stood at the summit for maybe 30 seconds before climbing back down. Her report described what happened next. The footsteps started immediately, following her for days, then weeks. She'd see movement in her peripheral vision, shadows without sources. She'd wake up in the middle of the night to hear breathing outside her cabin. She requested a transfer, moved to a desert park in Arizona. The last entry in her file was a note from her supervisor there, dated 6 months later. Patricia had walked into the desert without supplies and vanished. They found her truck. They never found her. Thomas looked up at Bill. "What are they?" "The things that follow people." Bill shrugged. "We don't know. Some people think they're guardians, protecting the stairs. Some think they're prisoners, trapped somehow by climbing them. One theory I've heard is that the stairs are doors, and going up them halfway opens the door, but doesn't take you through. So something else comes through instead." That was 4 years ago. Thomas still works as a ranger, though he transferred to a different section of the Daniel Boone Forest, one with no reported stairs. But the footsteps never stopped. He hears them on every patrol, always the same distance behind. Quarter mile back, matching his pace exactly. He's learned to live with it mostly. Learned to ignore the sound of boots on leaves when he's alone in the forest. Learned not to turn around when he feels breath on his neck. But last month, something changed. He was hiking a new trail, marking boundaries, when he found another set of stairs. Not mahogany this time. These were painted white, ornate, with decorative spindles. 14 steps. And standing at the top, looking down at him, was a woman. Older, maybe 60, wearing a ranger uniform from the 1980s. She smiled at him, a sad, knowing smile, and mouthed 2 words. "Don't follow." Then she turned and walked up into the air, into nothing, and disappeared. Thomas checked his maps later. He was in what used to be the Monongahela National Forest before the boundaries changed, near where Patricia Donnelly had last been seen. He hasn't told Bill about it, hasn't told anyone, because he knows what it means. The stairs aren't just doors, they're traps. And everyone who's climbed them is still there somewhere, walking in a forest that exists beside ours, but not quite in it. Walking forever. Being followed. And one day, Thomas knows he'll climb another set. Not because he wants to, but because whatever is following him will get close enough to push. Story. The Singing Hollow. Rebecca Crane heard her grandmother singing in the woods behind their family cabin at 2:17 a.m. The old lullaby she'd sung to Rebecca when she was small, the one about the mountain laurel and the whippoorwill. But her grandmother had been dead for 8 months, and the voice wasn't coming from one direction. It was coming from everywhere at once, echoing through the hollow, harmonizing with itself. That's when Rebecca's 3 children started sleepwalking toward the sound. The Crane family had owned property in the Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina for 4 generations. A small cabin on 12 acres, tucked into a hollow between 2 ridges, accessible only by a rough dirt road that became impassable in winter. Rebecca's great-grandfather had built it in 1947, and every summer since, the family gathered there for reunions. It was tradition. Sacred tradition. Rebecca, her husband Michael, their 3 kids, along with Rebecca's sister Amanda and her family, had driven up from Atlanta for the 4th of July weekend in 2022. But what happened next changed everything. The first 3 days had been perfect. The kids, ages 6 to 12, ran wild through the woods like their parents had done at that age. They swam in the creek, caught salamanders, made forts out of fallen branches. The adults drank beer on the porch, told stories, watched fireflies emerge at dusk. It was exactly what they'd needed after 2 years of pandemic isolation. A return to normalcy, a return to family. But on the 4th night, normality shattered. Rebecca woke to the sound of singing. At first, still half asleep, she thought it was a dream. Her grandmother Grace had died the previous November, and Rebecca still dreamed about her voice, that distinctive mountain accent, the hymns and folk songs she'd known by heart. But as Rebecca became more alert, she realized the singing was real, outside the cabin, in the woods. And it was her grandmother's voice, unmistakable, singing "Hush, Little Baby," in that slow, mournful way she always had. Rebecca sat up in bed, her heart pounding. Michael was snoring beside her, oblivious. She got up, walked to the window, and looked out at the dark forest. The singing continued, but now she could hear something impossible. Multiple voices, all her grandmother's voice, but layered, harmonizing in 3 or 4-part harmony. One voice singing the melody, another singing a high descant, another a low counter-melody. All perfectly synchronized, all unmistakably Grace Crane. Rebecca's hand shook as she opened the bedroom door and stepped into the cabin's main room. The fire in the wood stove had burned down to embers, casting barely any light. But in that dim glow, she saw them, her 3 children, standing in a line in front of the door, facing it, completely still. Emma, 12. Jacob, 9. Little Sophie, 6. All standing perfectly straight, eyes open but unfocused, like they were in a trance. And they were, humming along with the singing outside, in perfect pitch, in perfect time. "Emma," Rebecca whispered. No response. She moved closer, touched Emma's shoulder. The girl didn't react, didn't even blink, just kept humming. That eerie monotone hum that matched the melody outside. Rebecca shook her harder. "Emma, wake up!" Nothing. She tried Jacob. Same result. Sophie. The same. All 3 children were locked in some kind of shared trance, responding to the singing in the woods. Rebecca ran back to the bedroom, shook Michael awake. "Something's wrong with the kids. Wake up. Now." Michael, still groggy, followed her into the main room. When he saw the children standing like that, humming in unison, his face went pale. "What the hell?" He clapped his hands loudly. The children didn't respond. He shouted their names. Nothing. And outside, the singing continued. That impossible multi-voice harmony, all in Grace's voice, all singing the same lullaby. That's when Emma started walking, not toward the couch or the kitchen, toward the door. A slow, deliberate walk, hands at her sides, eyes still unfocused. Michael jumped in front of her, blocking her path. She tried to walk around him. He grabbed her shoulders, held her in place. She struggled, not violently, but persistently, trying to push past him, trying to reach the door. And she was strong. Stronger than a 12-year-old girl should be. Michael had to use real force to hold her back. "Rebecca, get your sister." Michael's voice was strained, panicked. Rebecca ran to the back bedroom where Amanda and her husband Kevin were sleeping with their 2 kids. She pounded on the door. "Amanda, get up! Now! Something's happening!" It took 30 seconds that felt like hours before Amanda opened the door, confused, angry at being woken. Then she heard the singing. Her face changed instantly. "Is that Mom?" "I don't know what it is, but it's not Mom. Mom's dead. And our kids are trying to go to it." Amanda pushed past Rebecca into the main room. Her 2 children, both under 8, were still asleep, thank God. But the Crane kids were now all moving toward the door, slowly but relentlessly, while Michael tried to physically block all 3 of them. Kevin, a former college linebacker, joined him, and together they managed to hold the children back. But it was a struggle. The singing changed. The lullaby ended, and a new song began. Amazing Grace, Grace Crane's favorite hymn, the one they'd sung at her funeral. And the moment it started, the children stopped struggling. They stood completely still, and then, in perfect unison, they began to sing along. 3 children's voices joining the impossible chorus outside, all singing in 4-part harmony that they shouldn't know, couldn't know. Emma had never learned harmony. Jacob couldn't carry a tune normally. Sophie was 6 years old. But now they sang like a trained church choir, their voices blending perfectly with the voice in the woods. Rebecca felt tears streaming down her face. This was wrong. This was a violation. Whatever was out there was using her mother's voice, her mother's songs, to call to her children, and it was working. When the verse ended and the chorus began, the children started moving again. But this time, they moved together, in lockstep, toward the door, and no amount of physical restraint was stopping them. Michael and Kevin were both big men, but the children were fighting with a strength that defied their size. Emma broke free from Michael's grip and reached the door handle. Amanda screamed, "The windows! They're trying the windows!" Sure enough, Jacob and Sophie had changed course, moving toward the cabin's 2 front windows, still walking with that eerie synchronized movement. Kevin grabbed Jacob, but the boy kicked him hard in the shin, and Kevin went down. Rebecca lunged for Sophie, caught her around the waist, and held on as the little girl thrashed with terrifying force. Emma had the door open now, halfway, and Michael was trying to pull her back, but she had her fingers wrapped around the doorframe, holding on with impossible grip strength. Through the open door, Rebecca could see into the darkness, and there, at the edge of the tree line, maybe 30 yards from the cabin, was a figure. A woman's figure, wearing what looked like a long white nightgown, standing perfectly still. The singing was coming from her, or from around her, or from the forest itself, Rebecca couldn't tell. But the figure was watching them, and as Rebecca stared, the figure raised one arm, beckoning. And all 3 children lunged toward the door simultaneously, nearly breaking free. Kevin, back on his feet, slammed his weight against the door, forcing it closed with Emma's hand still on the frame. She didn't cry out, didn't seem to feel pain, just pulled her hand back and immediately tried the door handle again. Michael grabbed her around the waist and physically carried her away from the door. But she fought him like a wild animal, biting, scratching, screaming now. Not words, just raw, anguished screams. And outside, the singing grew louder, more insistent, adding a 5th voice, a sixth, all layered harmonies in Grace Crane's voice. "We have to wake them up," Amanda was shouting. "Cold water! Slap them! Something!" Rebecca ran to the kitchen, filled a pot with cold water from the pump, and threw it in Emma's face. Emma sputtered, blinked, and for a second her eyes cleared. "Mom?" she said, confused. Then the singing hit another crescendo, and her eyes glazed over again, and she was fighting to reach the door once more. This went on for 47 minutes. Michael checked his watch afterward. Couldn't believe it had only been 47 minutes. It felt like hours. The children fighting to reach the door, the adults restraining them by force, the singing continuing without pause, cycling through every hymn and lullaby Grace had ever sung. The figure at the tree line never moved, just stood there watching, occasionally beckoning. And then, at 3:04 a.m., it stopped. The singing cut off mid-word. The figure at the tree line vanished, not walking away, just gone, like someone had switched off a light, and the children collapsed. All three of them, simultaneously, just dropped to the floor like puppets with cut strings. Emma, Jacob, and Sophie lay there, breathing but unconscious, completely limp. Michael checked their pulses. Normal. Breathing. Normal. But they wouldn't wake up. Amanda called 911, but the dispatcher said the nearest ambulance was over an hour away on those mountain roads, and if the children were breathing and stable, it might be faster to drive them to the hospital in town. Kevin and Michael carried the kids to the car, while Rebecca and Amanda threw their belongings into bags. They were leaving. Right now. They would never come back. The children woke up during the drive down the mountain, about 20 minutes after they'd collapsed. They were groggy, confused, with no memory of what had happened. The last thing Emma remembered was going to bed. Jacob thought he'd had a bad dream, but couldn't remember details. Sophie asked why they were in the car, why it was still dark. They didn't remember the singing, the trance, the struggle. They seemed fine. Physically fine. But Rebecca knew better. They took the children to the emergency room anyway. The doctors ran tests. Everything came back normal. No drugs in their system, no signs of seizure activity, no neurological abnormalities. The doctor suggested a shared stress response, possibly triggered by carbon monoxide from the wood stove, even though the cabin's CO detector had never gone off. He prescribed rest and observation and sent them home. But he couldn't explain why all three children had experienced the exact same trance, the same behaviors, at the same time. Rebecca did her own research. She called her Uncle James, Grace's brother, who still lived in the area and knew all the old stories. At first, he didn't want to talk about it. Then, finally, he told her the truth. The hollow where the cabin stood had a name. The old-timers called it the Singing Hollow. There were stories going back generations about voices in the woods, usually voices of the dead, singing to call people into the forest. Most people who heard them, and resisted, lived to tell about it. But some, especially children, followed the voices and were found days later, miles deep in the forest, with no memory of how they got there. Some were never found at all. "Your grandmother knew the stories," Uncle James said. "She told me once that she'd heard the singing herself when she was a girl, staying in that cabin with her parents. Said it was her aunt's voice, singing church songs. She ran outside to find her, and her daddy caught her halfway to the tree line and dragged her back. She didn't remember doing it. Just woke up in her bed the next morning with bruises on her arms from where he'd held her." Uncle James paused. "I think maybe using Mom's voice to call your kids was intentional, like it knew it would work, like it was personal." Rebecca never went back to the cabin. She tried to convince her sister to sell the property, but Amanda refused, said it was family land, said what happened was a fluke, could be explained. But 6 months later, Amanda called her crying. They'd gone back for Thanksgiving weekend, just their family. And on the second night, Amanda had heard her mother singing in the woods. Her children had started sleepwalking toward the sound. She'd managed to get them in the car and leave, but barely. The property went on the market the next week. But what happened next changed Rebecca's life forever. Last month, Sophie, now 7, woke up screaming from a nightmare. Rebecca rushed to her room, held her, asked what was wrong. Sophie, still crying, said, "Grandma Grace was in my dream. She was singing to me, and she said she's waiting. She said one day I'll be old enough to come find her on my own, and then we can sing together forever." Rebecca felt her blood turn to ice. They don't live anywhere near North Carolina now. They're in Oregon, 3,000 miles away. But distance doesn't seem to matter. Whatever is in the singing hollow isn't bound by geography. It's patient, and it's still calling. Story 6, The Parallel. Hiker. Jordan Matthews saw himself die on the trail. Not a vision, not a hallucination. He watched himself, 40 years older, gray-haired and weathered, collapse on the Appalachian Trail at mile marker 347, clutching his chest, gasping for air. And then the older version looked directly at him and whispered, "Don't camp at Shelter 12. That's when Jordan realized he wasn't hiking the trail he thought he was hiking. He was walking through time itself. Jordan was 29 years old, a data analyst from Boston who'd quit his job to thru-hike the Appalachian Trail. It was September 2023, and he was 3 months into his journey, making good time, averaging 15 miles a day. He'd started at Springer Mountain in Georgia back in June, and was now somewhere in Virginia, that endless stretch where the trail seems to go on forever through the mountains. He was experienced, prepared, hiking alone by choice. He'd met other hikers along the way, shared campsites, swapped stories, but he preferred the solitude, the rhythm of walking, the simplicity of moving through the forest with everything he needed on his back. It was meditation. It was therapy. But what happened next changed everything. It was September 19th, a Tuesday, and Jordan had been hiking since dawn. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, clear skies, the kind of day that makes you grateful to be alive and outdoors. He was approaching a section of trail known for its overlooks, planning to stop at one for lunch and take photos. His GPS watch showed he'd covered 8.2 miles so far, right on pace. The trail here was well-maintained, clearly marked with white blazes on trees every 100 feet or so. He'd passed 2 other hikers, going the opposite direction earlier that morning, exchanged pleasantries, kept moving. Around 11:30 a.m., Jordan noticed something odd. The trail markers were wrong, not missing, not faded, but wrong. The white blazes that marked the AT were still there, but now there were also blue blazes. Blue blazes usually indicated side trails or alternate routes, but these were on the same trees as the white blazes, overlapping them, like someone had painted both colors on the same markers. Jordan stopped, pulled out his guidebook. No mention of blue blazes in this section. He checked his GPS. It showed him on the trail, exactly where he should be, following the correct route. But the blue blazes didn't make sense. He kept walking, figuring it was just old paint from a previous trail reroute that hadn't been removed. But then he saw the sign, a wooden trail sign he'd passed 2 hours earlier, pointing to a shelter that was 4.2 miles ahead. Except he'd already passed that shelter before he saw the first sign. He was moving north. The shelter should be behind him. But here was the sign again, pointing north, saying 4.2 miles. Jordan felt a prickle of unease. He pulled out his phone, checked his photos. Sure enough, he'd photographed that exact sign at 9:17 a.m., 2 hours ago. The photo showed the sign in slightly different lighting, morning light, but it was the same sign, same tree, same location. Jordan turned around, looking back the way he'd come. The trail behind him looked normal. Trees, rocks, the white blazes marking the path. He turned forward again. The trail ahead looked identical. No visible difference. But he'd somehow walked in a circle without realizing it. Or the trail had looped back on itself. Or something else was happening that his rational mind couldn't quite grasp. He decided to keep moving forward, paying closer attention to landmarks, making mental notes of specific trees and rock formations so he'd recognize if he was passing them again. 20 minutes later, he saw the hiker, a man, maybe 50 or 60 yards ahead, moving in the same direction Jordan was moving, same northbound route. That wasn't unusual. Faster hikers passed, slower hikers all the time. Jordan picked up his pace, figuring he'd catch up, say hello, maybe ask if the guy had noticed anything weird about the trail markers. But no matter how fast Jordan walked, the distance between them stayed the same. The man ahead maintained exactly 50 yards of separation, matching Jordan's pace perfectly. Jordan stopped. The hiker ahead stopped. Jordan started walking. The hiker ahead started walking. Jordan tried running for a few steps. The hiker ahead matched his pace exactly. Jordan shouted, "Hey, wait up!" The hiker didn't respond, didn't turn around, just kept walking at that steady, unchanging pace. And that's when Jordan noticed something that made his skin crawl. The hiker ahead was wearing the same backpack as him, the same bright orange osprey pack with the same black compression straps, the same configuration, the same wear patterns on the shoulder straps. Jordan picked up a stick and threw it as hard as he could toward the figure ahead. It landed about 30 yards away, rolled into the brush. The hiker ahead didn't react, didn't look back, just kept walking. Jordan's heart was pounding now. He pulled out his phone, zoomed in with the camera, tried to photograph the hiker. Through the zoom lens, he could see more details. Same pack, same boots, same blue shirt, same hiking pants. It was him. He was watching himself hike 50 yards ahead of himself. And that's when the figure ahead stopped, turned around, and looked directly at him. But it wasn't him. Not exactly. The face was his face, but older. Maybe 5 years older. Lines around the eyes. Thinner hair. Same features, but aged. The older version smiled, a sad, knowing smile, and waved. Not a friendly wave, a warning wave. Like, don't come closer. Jordan stood frozen, unable to process what he was seeing. The older version of himself turned back around and kept hiking. Jordan didn't follow. He couldn't. His legs wouldn't move. He stood there for maybe 5 minutes, breathing hard, trying to rationalize what he'd seen. Heat stroke, dehydration, some kind of neurological event. But he felt fine. He drank water from his camelback. He checked his pulse. Normal. He pinched himself. He was awake. This was real. Or as real as anything could be when you're watching yourself walk away from yourself on a trail that shouldn't loop. But what happened next changed everything. Jordan heard footsteps behind him. He spun around. Another hiker, approaching from the south, from the direction Jordan had come. As the hiker got closer, Jordan's blood went cold. It was him again. A younger version. Maybe 24 or 25 years old. Cleaner, fresher, less worn down by months on the trail. The younger version walked right past him, didn't acknowledge him, didn't see him, just walked by like Jordan wasn't even there. And the younger version's eyes were unfocused, distant, like he was in a trance. Jordan reached out, tried to touch the younger version's shoulder. His hand passed through. Not like through air, but like through thick gel, like the space where the younger version existed was slightly out of phase with the space where Jordan existed. The younger version kept walking, heading north, following the trail. Jordan watched him go, watched him walk toward where the older version had been standing. And that's when Jordan understood. The trail wasn't looping. Time was looping, or layering, or bleeding through. He was seeing himself at different ages, all walking the same trail, all somehow occupying the same space, but at different points in their lives. Jordan started walking again, faster now, urgent, needing to get off this section of trail, needing to reach somewhere normal where the rules made sense. He hiked for 30 minutes without seeing any more versions of himself, started to believe it was over, started to breathe easier. And then he saw them. 5 versions of himself, all standing in a circle off the trail in a small clearing. Different ages. The youngest looked maybe 22. The oldest looked 70. All standing perfectly still, facing inward, looking at something in the center of their circle. Jordan moved closer, staying on the trail, not wanting to enter the clearing. From his angle, he could see what they were looking at. A wooden sign, fallen over, partially buried. He couldn't read what it said from where he stood. The oldest version, the 70-year-old, slowly turned his head and looked at Jordan. His lips moved. No sound came out, but Jordan could read the words on his lips. Shelter 12. Don't camp there. The other versions didn't move, didn't acknowledge Jordan, just stood in their circle staring at the buried sign. Jordan backed away, got back on the trail, and started running. He didn't know where Shelter 12 was. He didn't know if he'd already passed it, or if it was ahead. He just knew he needed to get away from that clearing, away from those versions of himself standing in eternal warning. He ran for a mile, maybe more, until his lungs burned and his legs gave out. He collapsed on a flat rock beside the trail, gasping for air, head between his knees. When he looked up, the trail looked normal again. Single white blazes, no blue blazes. He pulled out his GPS. It showed him exactly where he should be, having made forward progress. No loops, no circles. He checked his guidebook. According to the map, Shelter 12 was 6.8 miles ahead. He'd definitely reach it today if he kept hiking at his normal pace. Jordan made a decision. He was going to hike past Shelter 12 without stopping. He'd camp somewhere else, anywhere else. He didn't know what would happen if he camped there, but the warning had been clear, had come from himself, from multiple versions of himself, including one who'd lived to age 70. That had to mean something. That had to mean he made it, survived, lived a long life. But only if he avoided Shelter 12. He stood up, adjusted his pack, and kept hiking north. 2 hours later, he reached Shelter 12. It was a standard AT shelter, 3-walled wooden structure with a pitched roof, sleeping platform that could fit maybe 8 people. There was already someone there, a hiker sitting on the platform, eating lunch. Jordan waved from the trail, kept walking, planning to pass by. The hiker called out, "Hey, you stopping here for the night? There's plenty of room." Jordan shook his head. "Thanks, but I'm pushing on a few more miles." The hiker shrugged, went back to his lunch. Jordan walked past the shelter, following the trail as it curved away from the structure. And that's when he saw it. About 20 yards into the woods, visible from the trail if you knew where to look. A small clearing. 5 trees, arranged in a rough circle. And in the center, a fallen wooden sign, partially buried. The exact clearing he'd seen earlier. The exact formation where 5 versions of himself had been standing. Jordan's hand started shaking. If he'd camped at Shelter 12 tonight, he would have found that clearing. He would have investigated it. And something would have happened. Something bad enough that multiple versions of himself, across decades, had tried to warn him away. He hiked another 7 miles that day before camping, the furthest from Shelter 12 he could manage. He pitched his tent, ate dinner, tried to sleep. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw them. 5 versions of himself, standing in that circle, staring at that sign, trapped somehow in a moment they couldn't escape. Around 2 a.m., Jordan heard footsteps outside his tent. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling his campsite. He grabbed his flashlight, unzipped the tent, shined the light into the darkness. Nothing. No one. But he could still hear the footsteps, walking around him, just beyond the reach of his light. A voice, his voice, older version, maybe the 70-year-old. You listened. Good. But it's not over. You'll see us again. Every through hike, every time you come back. We're all still here, walking the same trail, trying to warn the others. Time doesn't work right here. The mountains are too old. They remember everything, everyone who's ever walked through them. We're all still walking. We'll always be walking. Jordan finished his through hike 6 weeks later, reached Mount Katahdin in Maine in early November, completed his journey. He'd hiked over 2,000 miles. He'd seen beautiful views, met incredible people, had the experience of a lifetime. But he saw himself 11 more times during those 6 weeks, different ages, different sections of trail, sometimes ahead of him, sometimes behind. Once, he saw himself lying injured beside the trail, leg bent at a wrong angle, and he altered his route to avoid that exact section, and he never fell. The timeline kept changing based on his choices, based on which warnings he heeded and which he ignored. He's 31 now, 2 years since his through hike. He hasn't been back to the Appalachian Trail. But last month, he received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a photograph, taken with a camera he'd lost somewhere in Pennsylvania during his hike. The photo showed him sleeping in his tent, and standing outside the tent, looking down at him through the mesh, were 7 versions of himself. Different ages. All watching. All waiting. And on the back of the photo, written in his own handwriting, Shelter 12, 2008. You have to warn him. Story. 7. The Debt Collector. The Whitlock family woke up on October 15, 2021, and none of them could remember each other's faces. Mother, father, 3 children, all sitting at the breakfast table, recognizing voices and mannerisms, but staring at blurred features where familiar faces should be. And in the kitchen doorway stood a woman who looked exactly like their grandmother, Ruth Whitlock, who'd been dead for 6 months. She smiled at them and said, "The debt is due. Every 4 generations, you should have paid." That's when they realized the woman at the table with them, the one they thought was their eldest daughter, had been something else all along. The Whitlock family had lived in the same holler in Watauga County, Tennessee for 5 generations. The original homestead, built in 1890 by Ezekiel Whitlock, still stood, though it had been added onto and modernized over the decades. The current family, Dennis and Claire Whitlock, and their 3 daughters, lived in a newer house they'd built on the property in 2005, but the old homestead was still there, used mainly for storage and as a reminder of family history. The Whitlocks were coal country people, mountain people, proud of their heritage and their connection to the land. But what they didn't know was that their great-great-grandfather had made a bargain that would come due in their lifetime, and the price was worse than death. Dennis Whitlock, 47, worked as a mechanic in town. Claire, 44, was a nurse at the county hospital. Their daughters were Melissa, 19, home from college for fall break; Anna, 16, a junior in high school; and little Grace, 9. They were a normal family, went to church on Sundays, had dinner together most nights, argued about normal things like curfews and screen time. They loved each other, knew each other, or at least they thought they did. But what happened next changed everything. On the morning of October 15th, Dennis woke up at 6:02 a.m. like always, got out of bed, and looked at his wife still sleeping beside him. He could see her form, her body, her hair, but where her face should be, there was just blur. like someone had photoshopped her features out of reality. He could see the pillow, the headboard. Everything around her face was perfectly clear, but her face itself was an indistinct smudge. Dennis rubbed his eyes, blinked hard, thinking something was wrong with his vision. The blur remained. He stumbled to the bathroom, splashed water on his face, looked in the mirror. His own reflection stared back at him, but the face was wrong. He could see his hair, his ears, his neck. But the center of his face, where his eyes, nose, and mouth should be, was blurred. He could feel his face with his hands, feel his nose, his lips, his cheekbones. But he couldn't see them. He couldn't see his own face. Panic set in. He rushed back to the bedroom, shook Claire awake. "Something's wrong with me. I can't see my face." Claire sat up, looked at him, and screamed. Not because he looked horrifying, but because she saw the same thing he saw. A body with no face, just blur. Dennis grabbed her shoulders. "What's wrong? Can you see me?" Claire was breathing hard, hyperventilating. "Your face. I can't see your face. It's gone." Dennis felt his heart drop. "I can't see yours either. What's happening to us?" They heard footsteps in the hallway. Melissa appeared in the doorway. "What's all the yelling about?" Dennis and Claire both turned to look at her. Blur. Where their daughter's face should be, just an indistinct smudge. Melissa looked at them, and her expression changed from annoyed to terrified. "Oh my God! What's wrong with you? Where are your faces?" She could see what they couldn't see. She could see the blur. All three of them were experiencing the same thing. They couldn't see each other's faces. Anna and Grace emerged from their rooms, drawn by the noise. Same thing. All 5 family members stood in the hallway, looking at each other, seeing bodies without faces, hearing familiar voices coming from blur. Grace started crying. "Mommy, I'm scared. Why can't I see you?" Claire tried to comfort her. But how do you comfort a child when you can't even see if you're looking in the right direction? Their faces were gone, erased from perception, though they could still feel them, still function normally. They just couldn't see each other. Dennis tried to rationalize it. Mass hallucination, carbon monoxide poisoning, something in the water. He called 911, tried to explain what was happening. The dispatcher thought it was a prank call, but agreed to send an ambulance. Dennis hung up and turned back to his family. That's when he saw the 6th person. Standing at the end of the hallway, perfectly visible, perfectly clear, was his mother, Ruth Whitlock, who had died of a stroke in April, 6 months ago. He'd been at her funeral. He'd helped carry her casket. She was dead. But she was standing in his hallway, wearing the blue dress they'd buried her in, looking at him with an expression of deep sadness. "Mom," Dennis whispered. Claire turned to look where he was looking. She saw Ruth, too. They all did. The only face they could see clearly was the face of a dead woman. Ruth spoke, her voice exactly as they remembered it. "Dennis, honey, I'm so sorry. I tried to find the records before I died. Tried to warn you. But I ran out of time. The debt is due. Every 4 generations. Ezekiel made a deal in 1890. Your generation has to pay." Dennis didn't understand. "What deal? What are you talking about?" Ruth sighed. Ezekiel was broke, had nothing. The mine owners had cheated him. The bank was taking the land. He had a wife and 3 kids to feed. So he went to something old. Something that lived in the mountain before people did. He asked for prosperity, for security, for his family line to survive and thrive. And the thing gave it to him. Gave him everything he asked for. But nothing's free, Dennis. The thing wanted payment. Claire found her voice. "What kind of payment?" Ruth looked at her, that sad expression deepening. It doesn't take lives. It takes identity. Every 4 generations it comes to collect. It takes your ability to recognize your own family. Takes your faces from each other's perception. You can live, you can function, but you'll never see the people you love again. You'll spend the rest of your lives with strangers who sound like family, but look like nothing. And then, after you've suffered enough, it offers you a choice. You can accept a replacement. It will send one of its own to live among you, wearing a face you can see, pretending to be family. And you'll be so desperate for something to hold on to, you'll accept it. You'll let it in. Dennis felt sick. This can't be real. This is insane. But even as he said it, he knew it was true. He could feel it in his bones. The wrongness, the violation. Something had stolen his family's faces, and now it was offering a terrible bargain. Ruth nodded. Ezekiel accepted. The thing sent a replacement for his eldest daughter. Looked just like her. Sounded just like her. But it wasn't her. The real daughter was lost, trapped somewhere, and the thing wore her like a costume for 60 years. Walked among the family, bore children, lived a full life. And when she died as Sarah Whitlock, beloved wife and mother, and no one ever knew they'd been living with something that wasn't human. But what happened next changed everything. Melissa, the eldest daughter, spoke up. Her voice was different, flatter, less emotion. They already accepted this generation's replacement. Everyone turned to look at her faceless form. She continued, tone conversational, almost amused. 3 months ago, late July. Remember when Melissa went missing for 2 days? When she went hiking and got lost and you found her by that old cave system on the North Ridge? She came back different, quieter. You noticed, but you told yourselves she was just shaken by the experience. You ignored the little changes, the way she stopped laughing at Dad's jokes, the way she stopped arguing with Anna, the way she ate her eggs scrambled instead of fried. All those tiny differences you explained away. Dennis backed up, putting himself between the thing wearing his daughter and the rest of his family. Where's my real daughter? Where's Melissa? The thing tilted its head, a gesture that was almost, but not quite human. She's where all the collected ones go, in the spaces between the mountain and the earth, not dead, not alive, just existing, aware, watching. She can see you right now, actually, through my eyes. She's been screaming for 3 months, but you can't hear her. No one can hear them except us. Claire was crying now, broken sobs. Why? Why do this? What does it want? The thing wearing Melissa shrugged. It feeds on recognition, on identity, on the bonds that make you human. It's old, older than your species. It remembers when these mountains were young. And it's hungry, always hungry. The deal with Ezekiel wasn't mercy. It was a farm. Every 4 generations it harvests one of you and uses your form to walk among humans, learning, feeding, preparing for when there are more of us than there are of you. Ruth, still standing at the end of the hall, spoke again. You have a choice, same choice Ezekiel had. Accept the replacement, live your lives with faces you can't see, but with the thing pretending to be Melissa visible and clear. Hold on to that one familiar face, even knowing it's false. Or refuse. Reject the replacement. And the thing takes all of you, not just Melissa. All 5 of the remaining family members, lost to the spaces between, replaced by 5 new entities who will walk out of this house wearing your forms. Dennis looked at Claire, at the blur where her face should be, and knew she was looking back at him with the same expression of horror and helplessness. He looked at Anna, at Grace, at the faceless forms of his 2 remaining daughters. Then he looked at the thing wearing Melissa, the only clear face in the house besides Ruth's ghost. It smiled. Melissa's smile. Perfect replica. "Take your time deciding," it said. "But not too much time. I'm already getting bored of being 19. I think I'll age into my 20s soon. Maybe get married. Have children. Your grandchildren, Dennis. Can you imagine? Your grandchildren, raised by something that ate your real daughter's identity like candy." The ambulance arrived. Paramedics found the Whitlock family in the hallway, all staring at each other, all trying to describe a medical condition that didn't make sense. Face blindness, but only for family members. Prosopagnosia that was selective and simultaneous across 5 people. The doctors at the hospital ran tests, CAT scans, MRIs, blood work. Everything came back normal. Neurologically, they were fine, but they still couldn't see each other's faces. The phenomenon had no medical explanation. The doctors used terms like mass psychogenic illness and shared hysteria, and prescribed antipsychotics that didn't work. The Whitlock family went home 3 days later, released from the hospital with no answers and no hope. They learned to navigate their house by voice, by touch, by memory. Dennis put labels on bedroom doors so he could remember which daughter was which. Claire set alarms to remind her which child needed to be where at which time. They functioned. They survived. But they weren't a family anymore. They were strangers living in the same house, connected by memory and obligation, but not by recognition. And the thing wearing Melissa stayed with them, visible, clear, always smiling. It went back to college after fall break, came home for Thanksgiving and Christmas, graduated the following spring, got a job in town, moved into an apartment, but visited every Sunday for dinner. It played the role perfectly. And slowly, over months and years, the family stopped looking for their real daughter's face and started accepting the replacement. Because the alternative, living forever with faceless strangers, was too painful to bear. But what happened last month made Dennis finally understand the full horror of what they'd accepted. Grace, now 11, came to him crying, "Daddy, I saw Melissa yesterday. Not the Melissa who lives here, the real one. I saw her face in my dream, and she was trapped inside a mountain, and she was screaming my name, and she said there are hundreds of them in there. Hundreds of people, all trapped, all replaced, going back generations." Dennis held his daughter, felt her body shaking, and realized the truth. The thing hadn't just taken Melissa. It had shown Grace what was waiting for her, shown her what would happen when Grace had children of her own, and the debt came due for the 6th generation. The Whitlocks still live in that house in Watauga County, still can't see each other's faces, still sit down to Sunday dinner with the thing that replaced their eldest daughter. Because they made their choice. They chose the illusion of normalcy over the reality of loss. They chose one clear face over 5 faceless strangers. And every day, Dennis looks at that thing sitting at their table, wearing his daughter like a mask, and he wonders, how many others? How many families in these mountains are living with replacements, too afraid or too desperate to reject them? And when will the thing get bored of playing Melissa and decide to collect someone else? Maybe Anna, maybe Grace, maybe all of them at once. The old homestead still stands on the property, built by Ezekiel in 1890. Dennis went there last week, searching for records, trying to find documentation of the original deal. In the basement, behind a loose stone, he found a journal. Ezekiel's handwriting. The last entry, dated June 1936. It came from my Sarah in 1894. I let it take her. God forgive me. I was so desperate I let it take her. And the thing that came back looked so much like her that I almost believed it was her. Almost. But Sarah had a birthmark on her left wrist. The replacement doesn't. It forgot that one detail. And now I live every day knowing my real daughter is somewhere in that mountain, screaming, and I can hear her sometimes late at night when the wind is right. She's still 9 years old, still calling for her papa, and I can't save her. Can't even see her face anymore to remember what I lost. Dennis closed the journal and understood. The thing makes mistakes, small mistakes, details it misses when copying a person. And if you know what to look for, you can tell the replacement isn't real. He went home, watched the thing wearing Melissa, and started looking for inconsistencies. It took him 3 weeks to find it. Melissa had a childhood scar on her right knee from falling off her bike at age 7. The replacement has smooth skin there. It forgot the scar. It's not perfect. And now, Dennis knows that every time he looks at that clear, visible face at his dinner table, he's not looking at his daughter. He's looking at the thing that ate her.